All right, everyone. Well, welcome to session 7 out of our 10 now of our People of the Book study, the way Jews and Christians read certain passages differently. And last week we went over a biggie, and this week is another biggie, the so-called suffering servant song, if you want to be as alliterative as possible. But last week we had the Isaiah passage that talked about the virgin and how it connected to the Mary story of the New Testament. And it was sort of just like, there's one or two references that it kind of fits into. This one has a large passage, which we're going to read. There's 4 songs. This is the 4th of the so-called servant songs in Isaiah, in this section of Isaiah. But it's a much larger one, and there are numerous references throughout the New Testament to this. Well, what is this? What are we about to look at? The portion of the scripture that we're looking at today is from a section of Isaiah that's commonly called Second Isaiah. Has anyone ever heard that term before? Mm-mm. Isaiah was not written by one author. There are actually 3 authors, and because it was compiled over time. Basically, Isaiah was written, the first portion was written just before the exile to Babylon. The second portion, from which we're reading today, was written while they were in Babylon. And then the last portion was just before or just during the return from Babylon. So 3 distinct sections, 3 distinct authors. And one of the ways we can tell there's different authors, it's just totally different language, different whole approaches, okay, to writing this. There's a lot of ways, but that's a couple of the basic ways that they can determine that it's a different author and at a different time. So again, what we're reading today is from a section of Isaiah, roughly chapters 40 to 55, that is called Second Isaiah, and it's from the Babylonian exile. Part of the reason that the section of chapter 52 to 53 can take on a diversity of interpretations, which we're going to see, is because the text that we are about to read is some of the most difficult, multi-layered poetry / writings in the entire Bible. Okay? I often say that because there's a lot of passages that are different. But today, I have given you just one verse to demonstrate how difficult it can be and how divergent translations can be when looking at the same material. Okay, so in the class, I've handed out a sheet here. Online, I have a screen to share with you, and you'll see what I mean. Let's see if I can move over some of your beautiful faces so I can see the text. There we go. Okay, so what I've set up here is just 3 different translations of Isaiah chapter 53, verse 8. Okay. NRSV is the New Revised Standard Version. NJPS is the New Jewish Publication Society. And then the Septuagint, which is the Greek. So the Jewish Publication Society tries to use as much Hebrew. So the Masoretic texts, some of the ancient Hebrew texts that they have access to. The Septuagint uses the Greek from what we talked about, roughly the 2nd century BCE. Okay, so it's old, but it was that whole Greek translation of the Hebrew, and a lot of it changes, as we will see. So the NRSV says, by a perversion of justice, he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. The New Jewish Publication Society, by oppressive judgment, he was taken away. Who could describe his abode? For he was cut off from the land of the living through the sin of my people who deserved the punishment. And then the Greek Septuagint. In his humiliation, his judgment was taken away. Who will describe his generation? Because his life is being taken from the earth. He was led to death on account of the acts of lawlessness of my people. That's just one example. That's one verse out of many, okay, that it's just wildly divergent. Now, to some of us, you look at those and they sort of say, you kind of, all right, there's small differences, but over time, the different translations present a hugely divergent picture of who this servant is. And mind you, the text itself never calls it distinctly a suffering servant. That's a term we've all, or many of us, have come to know that was created in the late 19th, early 20th century by a German theologian who kind of saw some similarities here in these ideas. And they try to be helpful. But it's sort of like, you know, how we talked about that there's labels in the Bible or the headings. Those are not part of the original text. Those are other people. So it's good to keep that in mind. Okay. But it's understandable how this kind of evolved, this idea of the suffering servant. So the whole point is that within Christianity, we look at the text we're about to read, and particularly one verse of it, chapter 53, verse 5, where it says, "But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed." That's from the New Revised Standard. That should ring familiar, because it's part of the essence of that redemptive atonement theology that a lot of us have been raised with. We know this story, right? We see this story. And in fact, all the synoptic gospels play on exactly that verse. The way Jesus' passion plays out utilizes all of that terminology, okay? And so when we see that, and we see the gospel story about Jesus suffering and the cross, and then the acclamation and the redemption afterwards, and the ascension, we can't help but say, oh, well, obviously Isaiah was pointing to Jesus. Okay, as Christians, that's the lens that we have. That's what we have been taught. Okay, and Christians throughout history have affirmed that. They believe that. So that's why when you read the Passion stories, you will see examples of how Jesus is literally equated. The gospel writers equate him to the suffering servant in Isaiah. So all of these terms I'm about to read come from Isaiah. Okay, see if you can, sense where you've heard them before or heard them elsewhere. So in the Gospels, we hear Jesus refer to Jesus that blood is poured out for many. We hear about silence before accusers. Jesus, or the servant, being slapped and spit upon. We hear about the amazement of the Gentile ruler, Pilate, in the story of the gospel, but in Isaiah's version, not clear. The theme of a criminal saved and an innocent one killed. The association with criminals in death. We know the story from Luke, when he's crucified between the two thieves or robbers, those two. Burial by a rich man. That comes from Isaiah. You know that story, right? Joseph of Arimathea. Fate shared with transgressors, and scourging. So all of these details that we see played out in the Passion stories of the Synoptic Gospels come directly from this Isaiah passage. And again, throughout history, Christians have said, oh, well, this is so obvious that this is who it pertains to. But our job today is to say, okay, there is room to look at that. We can absolutely see that. But if this passage was written during the exile and it was intended to be encouraging, how encouraged would you be if you were living in a place and struggling and suffering, and someone said, hey, look, 500 years from now, the one is going to come. So don't worry about it. You'd be like, that's great. We don't care. Give us something that actually helps us. Okay, so that there might just be another intention or another way that Isaiah is utilized or can be understood that was actually meaningful for the people in the context, in which it was written. So our job today is to say, all right, well, what might have been some of the contextual connection of this story? Who might this have been referring to? And I will say right up front, that's as we say back from where I'm from, that's wicked hard, because it is so difficult, and the passage is not explicit. It just doesn't give us a lot, but there are some clues. Okay, so I hope that we will be able to find our way through some of this difficult material and then just open our appreciation of this powerful, this glorious text in a lot of ways. So that's my 2 cents. It's about 3 cents there. And if anyone has any questions, and for those that are not doing a video today, which is absolutely fine, make sure you give me either a little shout or the little hand icon if you want to be heard. Anyone have any comments about that? Any reflections? Cecily. And then Jay.
I'm sorry, I was just testing out my icons.
That's no problem. It works. We can hear you. So yeah, there you go. And I was like, oh, I can read this. No, she got it. Jay, you want to say something? I think it was Jay. Or, oh, no, I'm sorry. That was Robert. Robert, I think you had your hand up.
I did. I mean, just listening to you, Pastor, I think it reminded me of like a Bob Dylan song that, you know, it means whatever you think it does.
Oh my gosh. That is such a good example. Yeah.
And so, I mean, and I don't mean to say that in a diminishing way, but that's to really, we bring the value to it rather than it being given to us.
I think that is such a powerful example. Yes. Any of us who understand Bob Dylan's music, his songwriting, his lyrics are so powerful and provocative and rich. So they have these multiple layers of meaning. And then as he's gotten older, he is less intelligible when he sings them. So we really don't know what he's talking about anymore. And it really is open to wider interpretations. So I think that's a really apt description.
Thank you for sharing that auditory perception.
Well, I'm sorry, maybe others have a different opinion. I love Bob Dylan.
I do too, but I can't understand it.
That's what I'm saying.
I need closed captioning.
He makes his voice an instrument in itself, and it doesn't matter if it's intelligent.
Hey, don't be bad mouthing Uncle Bob.
Oh, geez, now Jay's speaking up. Okay, all right.
I'm not. I'm talking about my own limitations.
No, I understand. No, 40, it wasn't you. I'm watching Jay now though, because he got he's a Dylan. Anyway, that's a good example. That's a good reflection that these texts are just not easy, and they are multivalent. They have multiple layers, and it's always good to sort of say, all right, let's acknowledge that first of all, because a lot of us were raised, if we think back, we were raised to say, oh no, Isaiah only means this. Isaiah was pointing towards Jesus. We're taught that. And yet that just sort of, you can see what it does. It sort of squeezes out the other context, the other meanings that are there as well. That's our job. That's our job in Bible study. It's not to say, oh, that's wrong. No, there's good reason that Christians believe that way and use this text this way. But there's a broader appreciation. Anyone else have any comments or questions? Okay. Well, go ahead, Horty.
I'm sort of sitting here with a sense of amazement of the opening of all these possibilities that in this many years of my life, I've never taken the time or had the opportunity to have things pointed out as being this complex. And so I am just on the edge of my seat. I really am about exploring this and listening and just opening the realms of understanding. So just thank you.
I love that. That's why I get fired up for Bible study. It doesn't devalue my faith. It enriches it. It lifts it. It helps me expand it. So I hope that happens for everyone. If not today, then on balance, because yes, sometimes we will be challenged, especially if we were raised in a certain perspective and it was, drilled into us over many years. That's not easy to but that perspective is so valuable because I want to hear that. I want to hear where the struggle is because that's part of the deal here. And as Horty noted, sometimes when we see it opened up and we can see and we can understand, oh, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Even if it's not complete, even if it's a little confusing in parts, some of this doesn't lie flat. That's just the truth. But even to acknowledge that gives us the humility to then become more responsible in the way we utilize and apply our faith. And maybe we stop pointing fingers at other people for being wrong, and I don't think that that's how our church and how we tend to approach this, but hey, that's a part of humanity that we want to be right at times, and it's so if we're right, then that leaves some people, no, well, this text is a lot more broad than many of us have been taught.
I
Bonnie?
just wanted to say, until now, I never considered could possibly be any other interpretation. And so I think even if you come away with, I still believe what I always believed. It helps you to understand somebody else's viewpoint,
Yes.
even if like, oh, well, I can understand where they're coming from, and we may not agree, or we may have to discuss or debate or explore further, but at least it gives you a better understanding of people that have a different perspective and
Yes.
are coming from another place.
The difference is, and thank you for that, the difference is, it moves us from the place, well, this is what I was taught, this is what I believe, this is what it is, which shuts down conversation. It leads you to the place that Bonnie's named, and that is, we can keep the conversation going, because it's not all about me having all the answers. It's about knowing that there are multiple approaches to these texts. It was written during the Babylonian exile. Does that matter? We shall see. We shall see. Because, Christians think, it doesn't matter. It's all about pointing to Jesus. So it's taken out of time. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Because it's like I said, it's not the easiest of texts. You're going to have to wear your sleuthing caps today. Okay, so that's all right. Marilyn, I see your hand up.
Yes. I was very, at first, kind of appalled at how the servant was described in the version that I read.
Uh-huh.
Not anything like the different portraits of Jesus that I've seen.
That's good
Yeah.
noticing. Yep. That's
Yeah, and so it occurred to me, I wonder if the portraits are inaccurate.
good. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then,
Go ahead.
and so I'm just looking I hope we're going to deal with that a little bit, because I'm really looking forward to what other people think.
Yes. Well, and I want to just say that that most of the portraits we see of Jesus are more theological statements than historical statements.
Mhm.
They're intended to be statements of belief. So they'll paint a picture of Jesus based on maybe the Isaiah passage, because they want to show their connection of Jesus to these stories. They'll paint Jesus in that light. So again, the art often is a theological statement more than a historical statement.
Well, and I think that the descriptions here in Isaiah are a theological statement.
Yes,
I mean,
I
that's
agree.
one thing that makes them acceptable to me.
Yes, and we'll get to it. And there's a lot of metaphor here. And there's going to be some things that we thought were there, maybe, that are not necessarily there. And that's always helpful to see too, where we sort of placed something that's, oh, wow, it doesn't say that, does it? Does that matter? We'll look at it. Okay. Let's we've got 6 paragraphs here. I've got the meetings here, so I'm going to open up this again. But before I open up on screen, could I have 2 volunteers from online to read the first 2 paragraphs, and then I'll go around the room here and we'll finish up here, because it's just a little easier to navigate because I can't see everybody once we open up the screen. So could I have 2 volunteers online?
Hello.
Okay, Marilyn, thank you. You'll do the first paragraph. And Jay, I was gonna call on you, Jay, so. Thank you for volunteering. No, but you do the second paragraph, okay? And then we'll go around the room here. All right, so the passage is Isaiah 52, verse 13 to 53, verse 12. See, that makes it memorable. Okay, go ahead.
See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up and shall be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate.
Thank you.
Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like the young plant and like a root out of the dry ground. He had no form or majesty, or we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. he has despised and rejected, he was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and he held him of no account.
That might be some of what Marilyn was referring
Yep.
to as far as the description. Yeah, we'll come back to that for sure. Okay, could I have 4 volunteers from around the room? Okay, you can just go ahead and read if you're willing to. But nice and loud.
Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we have counted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent. So he did not open his mouth. By perversion of justice, he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth.
I'm going to pass. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with afflictions. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offering and shall prolong his days. Through him, the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish, he shall see. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one made my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities.
Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors.
All right, thank you all. That is the 4th servant song. I'm going to close this. I'll be happy to open it again because I just want to be able to see your faces as we talk about this. But if anyone wants it back up, always just let me know. So we read that passage, and again, as some noted, we don't often read that passage, or we don't read it in total. We'll read like a scripture here. You'll see an allusion in Matthew, where Matthew is constantly saying, "Oh, this happened to fulfill the prophecy from Isaiah." Very much trying to lead us. And again, Matthew is often quoting it much differently than it actually appears. And that's not bad. It's just his theological commentary. It's what he's adding to it. Okay. But now that you've read it, what are some of the things that stand out? And if that's too vague, do you have any clues? What are some of the clues that Isaiah is giving you about who this servant might be? Can you glean anything? Start with Barbara, then Bonnie, and then we'll.
They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich.
Uh-huh.
That was kind of strange,
Yeah.
although he had done no violence.
Yes. Okay. So what does that mean when he says he made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich?
Yeah.
It's an indication that everybody got taken out into exile and they're all there together, struggling. Okay. It's not necessarily a literal designation here about him, his tomb is literally there, but it's a metaphorical way of saying they're all in this and struggling and suffering together. Okay. Because again, the context is Babylonian exile. And that comment is a really good one, that this was a perversion of justice. Okay, we'll get back to that. But other things that stand out to you as far as the descriptors of who this might be. What does it suggest, if anything? I saw Bonnie first and then Marcia.
I don't know if this is answering your question, but this certain verses here I memorized out of the King James. I don't know, middle school, whatever, years and years ago. And the first thing that popped out in my mind was surely he has borne our, I think it says diseases and afflictions or some infirmities and diseases.
Yep.
And I've always memorized that as griefs and sorrows.
Yep.
So I'm like, is that the same thing? I don't think that's the same thing, griefs and sorrows and infirmities and diseases.
I think in the King James, it was called griefs and sorrows.
It was.
In the Greek, it talked about sin. But in the Hebrew, it talks about infirmities, that he was a healer, that he, whoever this is, was bearing, you know, the infirmity of those around.
So it's the same, basically?
Well, they're different. Well, it depends. The King James was using the Greek translation. So that's why they would have had something totally different than say what the New Revised Standard today or other translations have utilized, or the Jewish Publication Society would have used the Masoretic text, which is a more middle age, like year 600 to 800, I think, but it's Jewish. It's a Jewish text. So,
And this says he was despised and rejected by others.
yes.
That's in the King James.
Marcia?
Well, okay, I could be totally off, but maybe this isn't one person, it's a people.
Marcia just suggested that maybe this isn't about one person, but it's a people. And do you know the earliest Jewish interpretations of this passage are exactly that? That this is a story written actually from the perspective of the Gentile rulers in Babylon, at first watching and sort of laughing and sneering at these Jewish people who are in exile, who don't even have their land anymore, but are still remaining faithful. And then all of a sudden, eventually, they do get freed. And it's this, and the way the early Jews understood this was like, wow, it's them coming to say, wow, that's amazing. I can't believe that actually happened, that you were freed and brought back to your homeland and you didn't drop your faith that whole process. And so the early interpretations within Judaism were that this was one of those passages that were sort of like how the Jews were a light to the nations. Their example of faith and of perseverance through difficulty and staying true to God were a means of converting Gentiles. That was the common interpretation. Now, there are arguments against that, namely that the Gentiles are not mentioned anywhere else in the servant song. So it's like, okay, it could be that, but it doesn't, there's no follow-up. There's no other corroborating evidence that that's how it would be. But I must say that in Isaiah 44, it talks about, oh, my servant Israel, oh, my servant Jacob, which is the people, not an individual. So there seems to be room that it could be applying and or referring to the entire people of Israel. Honeydee?
I was
And I
trying to
saw-
read this. I was trying to read this as I was in Babylon and I was exiled. And I was trying to figure out, how is this giving me any hope? Because I don't see a way that something's coming.
Yes. Oh, that's such a great comment. Okay, so Honeydee is noticing something. She's trying to put herself in the place of the exiles in Babylon. It's a really good practice. You know, try to do that once in a while and just say, all right, here's where I am. Now I'll read it and see what it does. She's noting that it doesn't seem to be that hopeful. Well, it's not necessarily hopeful in the way that we are longing for. It's not completed hope. It's indicative hope. Or it's the kind of hope that says, yeah, you're struggling now, but this ain't the end. I'm sorry I said 8. I won't say 8 again.
That's all right.
You ain't gonna say.
I ain't gonna say it.
It just ain't right. Just ain't right.
It just ain't right. Okay. Did I see someone else with a hand up? I did see an icon. I think it was. Karen.
Well, I was going to say exactly what Marcia said.
Excellent, excellent. Such a good.
Love you, Carol.
Yeah. But I want to also know, and this is for later, when you look at your Bibles, I want to know if those notes talk about that. Because sometimes Bibles tend to have a particular, it depends on the translation, have a very particular like Christian purpose. And so their notes will only mention sort of the Christian connections, the Jesus pointing in these texts. And I'd like to know, do different versions mention that? That's fine, but also mention, well, within ancient Judaism, this was looked at this way. I would love to know that some of that might be happening or not. because that's the truth of these passages. But a lot of our, our translations, they're very much, they're arguments. A translation is an argument. They're making an argument. This is what it means. And so they'll often try to, for the sake of clarity, say, oh, we're going to keep you on this path. And what I'm doing is, okay, that's fine. That's one path amongst all these paths. Okay, and I think it's important to look at. So in time, as you look at this, I'd like to hear or just note, have you note what your notes are telling you from these passages. Was there anyone else that had a hand up at this point?
I just have one thing.
Bonnie has a comment? Okay.
This is 52:12, so it's just before this starts. And it does say delivered captives will not have to hurry in their return to Jerusalem as their ancestors did when delivered from Egypt. They can move deliberately and safely with the Messiah in front and God in back. And back here it
And
talks
what
more.
chapter is that?
That's 52:12, not with haste. For you shall not go out with haste, nor go by flight. For the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. And then you start into this passage.
Yeah.
So that's just right before it.
It is just right before it. And you bring up an interesting word. She mentioned the word Messiah.
Yeah.
Okay. The Messiah is what Jews were hoping for, but it's also what Christians were hoping for in the Gospels. And does our passage that we read today mention a Messiah? The word Messiah is not mentioned in this particular psalm. And where Messiah is mentioned in Isaiah, it pertains to a particular person, Cyrus of Persia. Who remembers? Well, does anyone remember who Cyrus of Persia was? It's a famous, there's a famous edict of Cyrus. What was the edict of Cyrus?
Esther?
Not Esther.
He has another name, I know, besides Cyrus.
You might be thinking of like Artaxerxes and some of the stuff from maybe. Cyrus of Persia was the one who liberated the captives in Babylon. Because remember, Persia became the new power. And their way of controlling people and their vassal states was to be kind and to allow the people to go back to their homeland to sort of foster good relations. So the Edict of Cyrus is what allowed the people to go back to their homelands. He is seen as a Messiah within Judaism because it was he who freed the people. He's looked at very positively in the ancient Israel scriptures. Okay, he is the one within Isaiah who is seen as the Messiah.
But what does Messiah mean to Jews?
The anointed one of typically of the Davidic line, that one that was going to become their shepherd king again, their guardian, to lead them back to the place of prominence, of faithful action, of identity, of power. So to lead them back to the glory days. The Messiah was the hoped for king, the hoped for one to return. And that theme, let's face it, that theme plays out. I mean, that's what Tolkien was writing about. That's the whole Lord of the Rings saga. This is what a lot of us long for. A lot of us in our lives, we identify certain messiahs or those people or leaders that were like, oh, if only we were back in those days, that kind of thing. Well, this is part of what these stories do. They capture the imagination and the hopes that the people have across generations, and they keep instilling it. Now, Honey D pointed out that this doesn't sound very hopeful. Well, I can tell you this. The book of Job was not hopeful sounding either, but on balance. And when you appreciate it as someone who has gone through suffering, it can be profoundly hopeful. Because texts like this aren't about the kind of hope that's like, don't worry about it, it's going to be all set. No, it's about the kind of hope that says, hang in there. You're not alone. See the difference? This ain't right. Oh, I did it again. It's a text that's telling us this isn't right. Somebody noticed that it calls it a perversion of justice. Wow, that's a commentary. What does that say to us? Well, a lot of us were raised thinking that, okay, back in ancient Jew, the old ways were, the Jews kind of thought, well, if you were healthy and happy and wealthy, it meant that you were without sin, that you were just a good follower of God, right? If you had a good life, it was a reward because you were obviously a faithful person. And if you were sick or if you were poor, it's somehow your fault because you just had a lack of faith or something your parents did. We've heard that story, right? And then Jesus comes to uncouple that, to sort of say, oh, no, it's not about that. You don't deserve your sins. And, you don't deserve your afflictions. They happen. Well, this passage is one among several within the Jewish scriptures that says, no, actually, even within Israel, that was not the only set idea. This text is telling us it was a perversion of justice that he was suffering like this, that the servant or this people were suffering like this. This was wrong. He didn't earn it. He said nothing wrong. He did nothing wrong. Okay, that's a powerful statement, important for us to note. If we carry that idea that, oh, those ancient Jews had this particular view of, the sort of health and wealth connected to sin or lack thereof. Okay, this is saying, no, there's another way. But there is not an explicit Messiah mentioned in this story. And how about this? Does the person or people mentioned in the story that we read, do they die? Does it explicitly say that they die?
Be crushed, but I don't see die.
It doesn't say die. It talks about, pouring himself out unto death, but that's an expression that's like basically coming right up because the early Jewish interpreters looked at all this and they said, well, look, but it has all this language about he's going to go through it and come near death, but he's going to live to see his progeny and his offspring. Okay, so right there, honeybee, that's a little semblance of hope. That's that nugget of hope. And it's all about like, okay, we get it. This is terrible. And it's not good for anybody. And it's a struggle. But please hang in there. This is not the end. That's the hope. It's a fledgling hope. It's a weary hope, but it's a hope. Comments about that? Robert.
Well, you spoke to that this is encouraging us to go another way. And just listening to this conversation and reading it, it just strikes me that it's not just another way, it's really a pretty contrarian way to what you described there as the dominant paradigm. You do good and then you'll get riches and all of that. And so it is really, so it's kind of an irony. I was thinking about that as you were saying, that there's all these writings are advocating that we kind of come to agreement and conformity about what something means when the very content is saying, no, there's, don't go this way, go a very different way than almost anyone we know.
Yes.
And best and definitely go the opposite way from any dominant paradigm that we are a product of.
Dominant paradigms can be seductive. A dominant paradigm is basically what a lot of us receive. This is what this story means. And so what happens when that gets ingrained in us, we become ardently certain. And when we become ardently certain that this is what it is, it makes it too easy to push aside someone else's perspective. It helps us, it makes us devalue the diversity of possibilities. And it also makes us miss, as Robert was pointing out, we can actually then miss what's already there in the text. But when we have certain blinkers on, we just don't see it. Marcia?
When you talked about hope, this came to my mind that through Christian history, hope is, don't worry, when you die, you go to heaven. It's like, don't worry about the suffering. You've got it made later. Instead of
That is one particular type of hope within a certain type of Christianity.
but it doesn't give the Job hope that you're not alone.
I agree. What Marcia's pointing out and what she's sensing is that within certain traditions, and some of which we've been raised in, the hope that we are given in Christianity, often based out of these texts from Isaiah, is that hope that's like, hey, if you're struggling now, don't worry, heaven's going to be great. Okay, that is not the message of Jesus. Okay, I'm not really talking about heaven. Jesus' message was, it starts now. It is here now. You are part of the kingdom of God now. Your hope is now. And it goes on forever for the life that is to come. But that whole idea of like, don't worry about it, let's just wait till heaven. You can see where that could just lead us to be like, okay, so screw everything. I'm going to just divest myself. I'm just going to disconnect. Jesus was all about, no, stay connected. Isaiah's song here is all about stay connected to the struggle and the suffering. Why? It wasn't because the more masochistic you are, the more God will love you. No, it's not that. It's not saying be martyrs. He's saying suffering exists. You know that Buddhist expression, life is suffering? Well, being in exile was a time of great suffering. Not for everybody. It was a cosmopolitan city, and you know, for the artisans and for the merchants, it could be good. But for a lot of them, it was a struggle to survive. You had no identity, you didn't have any power, you had to start over. Okay, so there's a lot of problems. There's a big struggle. Isaiah is saying it's going to be hard. It's not about being a masochist. It's just knowing that this is possible. And together we can do this. There's going to be something more. This is not the end. That's where they were. They didn't necessarily say, he wasn't trying to tell them, okay, in 5 years from now, Cyrus is going to do it. No, that's not what it's about. It's about saying, all right, where's our hope today? What can we find today? What's going to keep us going till tomorrow? Kathleen?
I have a little trouble with that verse 10. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with affliction.
Yep, we'll come back to that.
Okay.
I'll be talking about that in the next one. Yeah, that is a tough one. That is a tough one, but we'll look at that again in the context and we'll sort of see, all right, maybe it can mean this. But we'll come. I want to kind of pick up now, unless someone else had any comments. Marilyn brought up in her opening comments this whole idea of the physical description of this servant. Anything strike you about that? What stood out as you were reading that part of the passage? That was one particular paragraph, and I kind of brought it to your attention. What are some of the things that stood out to you that are maybe just distinctive or even different than what you ever been told or known?
It's a man.
Yeah, it's described as a man,
Yeah.
but what else? What else about it?
Suffering.
Suffering. But it's like, it's almost like, go ahead, Marilyn.
Yeah, what just occurs to me is that he was so hard to look at that nobody looked at him. People turned away. Well, when you think in the New Testament about the descriptions, say when Jesus was with John the Baptist and all sorts of people from different countries and everything were coming there to gather around him, hear what he had to say. Doesn't say anything about they couldn't stand to look at him though.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard for me to, so it makes me think that this is not any kind of a prediction of Jesus.
I think it's well said. It's at least an area that doesn't quite get connected. Okay, those dots don't get connected in the gospel. But the vision that this, to me, I'm thinking it's like Quasimodo from the Hunchback of Notre Dame. You know, it's the kind that everyone's like, but he's golden, like he's a wonderful, beautiful human being. And in the context of that story, he has like sort of a Christ-like, aspect to him. But regardless of that, the picture that Isaiah gives us is very sort of like, like it's just gruesome to look at.
Leper.
Nothing.
Yeah, like a leper, like someone you just want to just like push aside, not even acknowledge. Yeah, he was despised. Okay. All right. So, what's the other one I had there? Oh yeah, I already mentioned the whole perversion of justice thing. I wanted.
Yeah, Barbara wanted to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Go ahead, Barbara.
Well, I have the Jerusalem Bible here, and it's so graphic in its description. It says he was so inhumanly disfigured that he no longer looked like a man.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Like the elephant man.
Yeah, like the Elephant Man, like just think about, but that is such a different picture
Wow.
of what this servant is. And again, is it a person? Is it a people? Does it describe an experience? Is it literal? These are the questions we're left with. You know, this is poetry. It would qualify as more poetic than anything else, this the language that's used here and the way it's constructed. And again, poetry is multi-layered. You know, that's why it's like, oh, well, it doesn't just say this and mean this, it's all over. Okay, it's a lot of different things. But we're starting to see, okay, wow. And now do you see where it could be hopeful to be talking about the suffering of a person or a people in a tough situation like exile? When is it hopeful? It's hopeful when it's not the last thing, when it's not the end. And that's really all Isaiah is saying at this point. All the suffering is there, but there's always these things like we already mentioned, you're gonna see your offspring, and it's not the final death. It's part of or giving yourself unto death, but there's lots of ways that can actually play out. So as you read it again, just be noting, how is Isaiah saying this? What's he speaking to? Kathleen brought up that tough passage, verse 10. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him, the will of the Lord shall prosper. That is an interesting comment. Interesting comment. What do you think it means? Well, let's talk about it. What do you think that means? Or what do this is another good spot to say, okay, this is a tough one. So what does your Bible say? Or if you have that, or what do you think? And I just want to hear whatever you want to offer at this point. What does that mean? What could it mean?
Yeah.
Carol?
Well, when I saw the word offspring, what brings hope but a baby? And the fact that there are offspring now, you see hope for the next generation and helps you move forward.
Yeah. Yeah, it's once again, it's sort of that continued promise that you will get to see this. Yeah, you're going to be afflicted, but it's not that you are going to be like dead necessarily. Okay, that there's hope through that, through the suffering. Did you have something, Lonnie?
Well, it makes me think either it's not talking about Jesus, because as far as I know, he didn't have offspring, or he did, and we don't ever talk about it. So if it's not talking about the Messiah and Jesus and all of that, then who is it talking about? And if Jesus was married or not and had offspring, why has that never come up before?
Right.
But that's literal.
Exactly. That's quite literal.
That's very literal.
And how many of us have been raised to say, well, Jesus couldn't have been married. He couldn't have kids. He was pure. He was without sin. And so many of us have connected, at least in our childhood, we were told, oh, well, sexual relations is like the stain of sin, that sort of thing. Or it's like his purity was so important. But the truth is, as a Jewish man in that time when Jesus was ministering, he would have most likely been married. And if you're married, be fruitful and multiply. But it's not really clear. And the Gospels don't really give us a lot of that information. So a lot of that's speculative. Honey D?
What comes to my mind is that because Jesus died for us, he made us adopted children of God. We became inherited because of that afflictions that he bore.
And that is what the Christian interpreters took this to mean. They applied it to Jesus, and that he had his life, his suffering, and his death were redemptive for us. We were the ones.
We are the children of
We are
God.
his offspring. Exactly. That's what Christians kind of used this to mean. It's
But
very
I wonder how
beautiful.
the Jewish people took that because they didn't really see Jesus as.
Yeah, they would not have said that because this to them does not point to Jesus or a Messiah like that. Yeah. Horty? Go ahead, Horty.
Staying with the metaphorical, what came up for me is the offspring of the idea of hope, a new perspective that was born out of being and remaining with the suffering, that out of that can come a whole new idea for oneself. And that can be the offspring of oneself, is the birth of a new idea that may contain the nugget of hope.
That's right. All of this points toward just even that nugget, just that little spark that could get us through to keep going. You know, again, there's not a specific promise. It's a general promise. You know, it's not pointing to something like, yes, you're going to go back home in a generation, but it's giving them in that moment, yeah, life is hard right now. There's a big struggle. And to say it the way it's done, you know, the Jewish interpreters in the earliest interpretations of that passage, that tough one where it says, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. They did not believe that that was literally what God does. And many other places in, you know, the scriptures kind of back that up, that God doesn't use people like that. Yes, the story of Job, the parable of Job, is one that plays with that idea. But in the end, it talks about how suffering is real. Suffering and struggle and life and death, it's part of the chaos of the world. We got a free world, right? God set it all in motion and stuff happens, okay? So it's not God up there like Geppetto with a marionette. What this is talking about, and passages like this, are that suffering is not necessarily, it can have something beautiful. It can have a redemptive quality to it. It's not to say that it necessarily is so, but something beautiful can arise from it. That's what it's trying to focus on. This idea that, you know, suffering itself is nothing special about it, but suffering often leads to something more. Struggle that leads to growth, to just something beautiful emerging. We don't always get to see what that is. So he doesn't spend a lot of time saying, oh, so this is what it's going to be. No, just hang in there and trust that your suffering is I'm not glorifying your suffering, and it's not arbitrary, but your suffering may reflect yet the presence of God. 40.
And in the midst of suffering, it may well feel like this is an infliction from God. And that's sort of like going to the bottom of the pit. I have been persecuted by that in which I have put my entire faith. And when you're really in the pit of suffering, it feels that way.
Yes. Why do you think Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me in the worst moment of his life? That actually is an allusion to Psalm 22, which starts off with that very verse, that language that is absolute despair. But you read the whole psalm and it ends up with a spark of hope. Okay, this is what Isaiah is playing with. And what I'm asking you then is to say, okay, how might that narrative be hopeful for a people who are in exile? It could be very hopeful for them. It's basically saying we're all struggling, we're all suffering, everyone is hurting, but this is not the end. Hang in there. Okay. Any other comments about that particular? Oh, I see Marilyn. Yep.
Yeah, I want to tie all of this together with the appearance of the servant and the fact that nobody could even look at him and everything. And say that I think that may, if we think of the servant as the people, and there's some ways in which I like that way of thinking of it the best of what we've come up with. If we think of the servant as the whole group of Hebrew people who were in exile, then we could, if we think of the fact that they just had lost everything. And so they couldn't even be looked at. They couldn't even look at each other because they had absolutely, everything was gone that made them a people. And it seems to me that then if we look at these sections on what will happen, I will give him a portion among the great. He will divide the spoils with the strong. I mean, there are some really strong promises here. And if they've lost everything, then they could go back and just be a lost people, even when they got back home. But if they've been promised this kind of future there, it will make up for what they've lost.
God has not forsaken them. That's what this passage is. God has not abandoned them, even though it does feel like that. And in our humanity, that's what we call out. We do call out that it feels like when the worst happens that we've been abandoned. And that's a part of what this is. That's a part of what this is. But then in acknowledging that and being able to say that, the story is also saying, and it's not the end. Hang in. So, okay, where does this leave us as far as like taking a passage like this and understanding it in terms of, all right, the meaning we've always felt like connects to it, and then this other opportunity? I think it could be beneficial that Jews who hear this could see that, yeah, I get where this Christian understanding comes from, because it does correlate to a lot of this from a certain perspective. And there's something beautiful about that. I feel that the problem comes where you make that exclusive, that, oh, this is what it only means. And that's where we've often received that message. Within historical Christianity, by Honey D, within historical Christianity, it has been, there have been so many treatises written on this, and it's so many apologies, so defenses of this, basically trying to create a bulwark to say, this is all this can mean. To me, when I see that, it means that they're pushing against something. And they're pushing against that a text like this could be referring to lots of different people. Now, the problem with the text, it's not the right word, because it's not a problem. The challenge of the text is it never tells us. And that's why it's so open. And that's why historically it's been utilized the way it has. Doesn't mean it's wrong that Christians make it mean this, but Christians would do well to understand, well, what about the Jewish concept or the context? And how would that have impacted it? The more we can do that, the more I think we appreciate the hope that is a modern concept called liberation theology. This idea that God is with the persecuted, not to take away the persecution, but to trust that God is with them, and so that will not be the end. Because suffering, sometimes you go through it, and there's no one to take it away. And God never promises to take away all our suffering. God promises to be with us through it. So the idea of liberation theology, the idea of people like Martin Luther King, who are speaking of people's experience of suffering and struggle and giving hope to it, that's along the lines of what Isaiah might be doing here. And to allow ourselves to see that from a Jewish context is really powerful. To connect it to those ancient dots of what the people were going through. Can you think of other ways that this story could be, helpfully understood in your own way of thinking, or just even what's come up for you as we've been talking about this?
Yeah, can you see Robert?
Oh, I saw Bonnie first, but I do see Robert. Thank you for pointing that out.
This is kind of shaking up my whole concept, I guess. I'm not sure the right word. Ever since I was this high, missionaries would come to our church every so often. And they have gone to Africa, or they've gone to South America, or they've gone wherever they've gone to essentially convert people to Christianity. Maybe convert's not the right word, but spread the gospel, whatever you want, because that's the will of God, that the whole world should be Christian, right? And I'm sitting here listening to all of this and thinking, what if it was, what if God never wanted the Jewish people to eventually become Christian Jews? What if it's okay that they're just Jewish and that's what their belief is and that's what they practice? And it doesn't mean they're going to go to hell because they didn't become a Christian. It's really kind of shaky because there was always, I think I've talked before about this almost pressure that you had to go out and, win people for Christ and witness and
Yes,
and
yes.
all of that, because if you didn't, and if they never heard, then it's your fault, and they're gonna end up in hell, and it's your fault because you never told them. And I mean, it sounds comical, but it's really, a lot of people really take
This
it
is
very,
what a
very
lot of
literally.
us have received.
And they can't, yeah, and that's why you can't get through a conversation with some people without that coming around to that.
Yep.
You could be talking about a movie, you could be talking about what's happening on the news, the election, anything else. Somehow you'd end up on that topic. And I'm sitting here listening to this about the Jewish people who were in Babylon. And, they go through all these struggles, but if you look historically, they're continuing to struggle. People are still persecuting Jewish people. They're still blowing up synagogues. We're not quite to the Holocaust yet, but you listen to people, some people that are out there talking and very anti-Semitic and so forth.
Yeah.
And so it just kind of shakes up this whole idea, like, maybe it's okay that they just keep their Jewish faith and maybe they don't have to become Christians.
Anyone else all shook up? Kinda like when Elvis was it Ed Sullivan show when he first did the hip thing? That shook up the world. Okay, these things do blow our minds sometimes. And it's just those insights like what Bonnie had, and I want to get to Robert too. These do open us to saying, wow, how might a different perspective break open this story, shake up my faith? I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing. Robert?
Well, I like your analogy. I mean, I'm now realizing there's a good reason they call it liberation theology. And I think, like you said earlier, definitely the traditional kind of Buddhist view, and certainly for what was just said, the traditional Jewish view for good reason is life is suffering.
Yes.
Kind of the New Age Buddhism says pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that's a different framing.
It is a different framing. Yeah, that's a little bit of a nuanced conversation there. Yeah.
So I would say another different framing, because where everybody is kind of looking for somebody else, preferably to be the Messiah. And so what strikes me is, but Jesus himself said, you are the light of the world. And so that idea of who's going to be God's hands and feet, it seems like they're saying that it's us. Instead of
Robert, thank you for bringing this up. One of the issues with putting this story from Isaiah and saying, oh, it only means Jesus, is that it can lead us down that path that a lot of us do, where we rely on Jesus as our savior, the one who's the fixer of all the things. He's going to do it for us. He died for me, so I know where I'm going. It's not so much about that. He's inviting us into our suffering. He's saying, don't flee from it. Be in it. We know it's hard. I know it's hard. I lived it. Isaiah is saying the same thing. Hang in there, because it's not the end of the story. That's the redemptive power of it. It's not about Jesus fixing it for us, or any Messiah for that matter. Isaiah and others have reflected on this passage and said that's where it's leading us to, just what you said, Robert, that it's us who we share in that mission. It's not Jesus doing it for us. And all throughout the Gospels, those healing stories are always collaborative. All the different interactions that Jesus has with people are interactive. It's not just Jesus doing things for people. It's your faith made you well. Okay, that idea. It's collaborative. Okay, there's a beautiful reflection on this Isaiah passage from a priest in El Salvador in the late 70s. Now, anyone who remembers history, El Salvador was a terrible place. And the US and the Russian interests, was it Sandinistas there, or was that Nicaragua? I get a little, but it was just a lot of regime change, a lot of war, and a lot of death. And this priest says about this Isaiah passage, said, look, just because we believe that it prefigures Jesus from a Christian perspective, just because we believe this points to Jesus, do not lose sight of the fact that a passage like this reminds us of the suffering of every person that is still in the world and how many people are struggling this way, and that our call is to go there with them, not to let Jesus take care of it, but our call is to engage, get in there, knowing that God's presence is real in those places. That's where God is. We better go there too. You see the difference? Others have reflected and said, all right, well, where are those who are suffering now? People who are, who are the ones pushed to the margins now, whose voices are not heard, who are disfigured, who are hard to look at, or maybe we just don't look at. That's what texts like this invite us to. Not just to say, oh, Jesus is going to take care of all that. No, it's about leading all of us to that place where we can be part of the redemptive process that takes suffering and leads to them to some sort of freedom, some sort of beauty, some sort of wholeness. Courtney.
And combining my feelings right now with the thoughts that Bonnie was expressing, there's that whole thing of not just let the Jews be, but the Christianity is not the only path towards the holy. And that it's also okay to be Muslim or Hindu or any other belief system as well. But it also brings me back to that place of the birth of hope within us when we've reached the bottom of the place of suffering. And what's coming up for me right now is that to go and share suffering with others is not about telling them how to get out of it, but demonstrating the faith that there is a way out just by being, and by being quiet and just saying, I'm here with you. I'm here with you. And sometimes just having somebody hang out with you in the depth of your suffering allows you to realize how awful it is. But then it's sort of like a kid coming to the bottom of a tantrum. It's like, okay, now where's the peanut butter? When you hit bottom, there is the opportunity for there to be the birth of that place of hope that is intensely personal. And it's very different from somebody else saying, well, you should take insulin, or, oh, you should have a baby, or, oh, you should move, or let me tell you the path you should take. But just, I'm here with you. As God says, I'm as close as your next breath. And when you take that breath, there's the influx of the possibility of hope with that every breath.
That's right. The fact that we are alive. And this passage, multi-layered as it is, leaves room for the richness of those, what you just named, Tori, the conversations. Sometimes it's just about, hey, suffering is here. Sometimes we got to be in it. Sometimes we want to rush through it. Sometimes we don't want to experience the healing or the magic or the lesson, the teaching that can come through it. There's not always teaching. Don't get me wrong. This isn't, but sometimes there is. Sometimes it's about, hey, look forward to this. Sometimes it's about, here's a specific thing you can do. But mostly it's about just being with one another in it, trusting that it is not going to it's not going to last forever. And that's, when you look at your own lives, when you look at our lives, that's what suffering's like, and that's what healing is often like. That our healing isn't always about taking a pill or getting a procedure and clearing out that illness or that disease. Sometimes it's not about a cure, right? We talk about that a lot. Our healing isn't always about a cure. It's about a recognition that we are not alone and that our suffering is not just arbitrary, but that there can be meaning, that there can be hope, there can be beauty that emerges through it. Any other closing comments, Bob? Yeah.
Well, I probably have gotten in trouble before as an English major in college disagreeing with the teacher, but I had a little different interpretation in that, to me, there was the death of the servants. And through that death, they have offspring that carries on their legacy.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I would say this, there is room for that too, and I didn't really touch on that, so thanks for bringing that up. Because while many interpreters look at it and say, there's no necessary death in this story, some look at it and say there is a death. But one of the things the story doesn't mention is that there was a death, there was a specific way of naming it, that it wasn't about the death that was, he didn't die on behalf of others, like what we receive within the Christian message. It wasn't like a death that was on their behalf, but it was out of, the struggle and the suffering in that. So even if you look at it like Bob just said, it's not quite the same meaning that the New Testament lays on that death. But again, that's also vague. It's also vague. Did I see another hand? Yes, Marilyn.
I actually sent a chat, but I'm not sure everyone will see it. So I want to share what I was saying. These wonderful Tuesday, and I call them sharings. I appreciate so much hearing what each of you has to share. Anyway, it just means so much to me. I always look forward to it and I reflect about it afterwards. Thank you.
That's yeah, amen to that. I mean, that to me is one of the greatest gifts we give ourselves and each other when we do this Bible study. This is not just about our heads, about our hearts and our lives, and it's about our perspectives opening. It's about our world sometimes getting shook up. And again, then seeing where it settles out, seeing what opens within us, because we're about to go through this. It's officially the first day of spring. When you plant your gardens, you don't just shove the seed in that soil, you gotta churn it up, right? That's how things grow. I hope you all discover in your own ways, how that plays out this week, even with these texts that might kind of turn our whole, some of the things we've been taught upside down. It's a good thing. I see Robert and I see Boyce.
What strikes me as practical application of what was just being discussed about people who are experiencing pain. I heard a public radio thing. This woman was from Ireland, and she was commenting on how in America, maybe elsewhere, people kind of, when somebody's in pain or somebody's a death in the family, somebody will say, "Oh, my thoughts and prayers are with you." Yeah. And she said that in Ireland that we would never think to say that, even though it's a pretty Christian country. And she said, the translation in Gaelic is, "I stand with you," which is quite different than something else.
Gorgeous. It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. It's absolutely beautiful. Did I see one other hand or is? Voice, yeah. And then I see Horty. My battery looks like it's about to die, so we should be good. Go ahead.
Right when I start to talk, your battery dying.
I should plug it in.
What pain that is. I'm going to suffer over that.
Go ahead.
I just find this interesting because Isaiah, to me, with my counseling background, is giving some great counseling advice. And I looked at it and I see this servant being described kind of like, don't judge a book by its cover. This ugly person, but on the inside, the people find he takes on their sins. He takes on their pain. How can you not love somebody who's ugly on the outside, but has that godlike feature on the inside? I then see that the servant and the Messiah is us. He's telling us that on the outside, maybe we are rotten and ugly and everything, but on the inside, there's a godlike features. And so you can take on pain. And it reminds me of the saying, life is 90% of what happens to you, the pain that comes. Excuse me, that's not right. Life is 10% what happens to you, the pain and all of that. But the 90% is how you react to it. So if you react and look within at your own Messiah and take into account God's words, that you will be able to not have suffering from that pain. You will be able to turn that pain into possibly even joy.
That is one of the profound statements of hope, of stories like this for many, many people as we go through. Thank you, boys. Did I see one more hand up or I can't remember? 40?
to continue on with Robert's drawing, pardon me, Robert's drawing on the Buddhist teachings, chop wood, carry water.
She's glitching. But we know that story. I don't know, your connection just glitched there for a moment, Horty, but yeah, chop wood, carry water, and then I forget the rest of it, but it's just doing it again. It's the consistency. Go ahead, you're back.
Be in the midst of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Keep doing, keep living, keep participating, keep doing those things that really are necessities in your life. Don't just stop and withdraw and melt into your suffering, but continue to do even the basics. And in doing those things, there is the opportunity for the birth of this place of hope.
Amen. May our Bible study lead us to act, to live in that way. Thank you all for your awesome participation as always, and we'll see you next week for another fun one. It's going to be about the sign of June, so we'll find out what that is. So I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.